She collapsed right there in the hallway. Her lips were cracked, her hands trembling, and all she had asked for was a simple cup of water. But what happened next would expose a truth so disturbing that it would shake an entire school district to its core. Because the person who stepped in wasn't who anyone expected, and what they discovered would change everything. Let me take you back to where this all began. Shenaya Mitchell was 14 years old, a freshman at Riverside Academy, a prestigious school in suburban Georgia where the hallways gleamed with polished floors and the trophy cases overflowed with achievements. Shenaya had earned her place there through a scholarship program designed to bring diversity to the institution. She was brilliant, the kind of student who devoured books like oxygen, who saw patterns in mathematics that most adults couldn't comprehend. But brilliance, she was learning, didn't always protect you from being seen as less than. It was a Thursday in late September when the heat wave hit. The air conditioning in the old science wing had broken down 2 days prior, and the administration kept promising it would be fixed soon. The classrooms felt like ovens, the air thick and suffocating. Shenaya's third-period class was advanced chemistry, and she loved it despite everything else. Science made sense to her in ways that the social hierarchies of high school never would. That morning, Shenaya had forgotten her water bottle at home. Her mother, Diane, worked 2 jobs as a nurse and a weekend cashier to afford the uniforms and supplies that the scholarship didn't cover. They'd been rushing that morning because Diane's car wouldn't start, and they'd had to catch 2 buses to get Shenaya to school on time. In the chaos, the water bottle sat abandoned on their kitchen counter. By third period, Shenaya's throat felt like sandpaper. Her head pounded with the beginning of what she knew was dehydration. She'd learned about it in health class, ironically. When her chemistry teacher, Mr. Hendricks, a middle-aged white man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, began his lecture on molecular bonds, Shenaya tried to focus, but the words swam before her eyes. Halfway through class, she raised her hand. "Mr. Hendricks, may I go get some water from the fountain?" He nodded without breaking his lecture rhythm, and Shenaya slipped out into the hallway. The water fountain was just around the corner, one of those old-fashioned ones with the curved spout. She pressed the button. Nothing happened. She pressed again, harder this time. A pathetic trickle emerged, barely enough to wet her lips. The fountain had been broken for weeks, something she'd forgotten in her desperation. Shenaya looked down the hallway and spotted another fountain near the administrative offices. She hurried toward it, her vision starting to blur slightly at the edges. This fountain worked, and she drank deeply, feeling the cool water soothe her parched throat. She was bent over, taking another long sip, when she heard the sharp voice behind her. "Excuse me. What do you think you're doing?" Shenaya straightened up, water dripping from her chin, and found herself face to face with Mrs. Pemberton, the school's assistant principal. Mrs. Pemberton was a tall, severe-looking woman in her 50s who wore her gray hair in a tight bun and her authority like armor. She had a reputation among students as someone who enforced rules with rigid precision, showing favoritism to legacy families whose names appeared on plaques throughout the building. "I was getting water, ma'am," Shenaya said, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "This fountain is for staff only," Mrs. Pemberton said, her lips pursed into a thin line. "Can't you read the sign?" Shenaya looked up. There was indeed a small placard she hadn't noticed before, "Staff only." Her heart sank. "I'm sorry, I didn't see it. The fountain near my classroom is broken and I wasn't feeling well." "That's no excuse for disregarding clearly posted rules," Mrs. Pemberton interrupted. "You scholarship students need to understand that being here is a privilege, not a right. There are student fountains throughout this building. Use those." The words hit Shenaya like a slap. "You scholarship students." The implication hung in the air between them, heavy and unmistakable. Shenaya felt her face grow hot, but she couldn't tell if it was from anger, shame, or the dehydration that was making her increasingly dizzy. "I understand, ma'am. It won't happen again," Shenaya managed to say, though her voice came out smaller than she intended. "See that it doesn't. Now get back to class before I write you up for being in unauthorized areas during class time." Shenaya turned and walked back down the hallway, her legs feeling weak beneath her. When she reached her chemistry classroom, she paused outside the door, trying to compose herself. Through the small window, she could see Mr. Hendricks still lecturing, his back to the class as he wrote equations on the board. She took a breath and opened the door. The room felt even hotter than before, or maybe it was just her. Shenaya made her way to her seat in the second row, hyper-aware of the eyes that followed her. She was one of only 3 black students in this advanced class, and she always felt that visibility, that weight of representation. She tried to focus on Mr. Hendricks's lesson about covalent bonds, but the headache that had been building now felt like a vice around her skull. The words on the board started to swim and double. She pressed her palms against her desk, trying to ground herself, but the room tilted sickeningly. "Miss Mitchell, are you paying attention?" Mr. Hendricks's voice seemed to come from very far away. Shenaya tried to answer, tried to nod, but the world was spinning now, rotating on an axis that no longer made sense. She saw Mr. Hendricks's expression change from mild annoyance to sudden concern. She heard his voice, urgent now, calling her name. And then everything went black. When Shenaya opened her eyes, she was lying on the floor and Mr. Hendricks was kneeling beside her, his face pale with worry. Other students had gathered around, their faces a blur of concern and curiosity. "Don't move," Mr. Hendricks said gently. "You fainted. I'm calling the nurse." "Water," Shenaya whispered, her voice barely audible. "I just need water." "Connor, grab a bottle from my mini fridge," Mr. Hendricks called out to one of the students, never taking his eyes off Shenaya. Within seconds, a cold water bottle was pressed into her hands, and she drank gratefully, feeling the life slowly seep back into her body. The school nurse, Mrs. Chin, arrived minutes later with a wheelchair. She checked Shenaya's vital signs, asked her questions about what she'd eaten that day, whether she had any medical conditions. Shenaya explained about forgetting her water bottle, about the broken fountain, about the heat in the building. "Why didn't you drink from the staff fountain near the office?" Mrs. Chin asked innocently. "That one always works." Shenaya hesitated. She could feel Mr. Hendricks watching her, waiting for her answer. "I did," she said quietly. "But I was told I wasn't allowed to." Something shifted in Mr. Hendricks's expression. "Who told you that?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Mrs. Pemberton. She said it was for staff only, and that I should use the student fountains." Mrs. Chin frowned. "But the student fountains in this wing have been broken for weeks. Maintenance can't seem to figure out what's wrong with them. All the teachers know to send students to the staff fountain if they need water during class." Mr. Hendricks stood up slowly, and Shenaya saw something in his face she'd never seen before, a kind of quiet fury that made his jaw tighten and his hands clench at his sides. "Mrs. Chin, can you make sure Shenaya gets home safely and rests?" "Of course," the nurse said, beginning to wheel Shenaya toward the door. "Wait," Shenaya said, looking up at her teacher. "I don't want to cause any trouble. Please just let it go." Mr. Hendricks met her eyes, and his expression softened slightly. "Shenaya, you're one of the brightest students I've ever taught. You have nothing to apologize for. Sometimes the right thing to do is speak up when something is wrong. Trust me on this." As Mrs. Chin wheeled her out of the classroom, Shenaya glanced back and saw Mr. Hendricks already reaching for his phone, his expression grim and determined. What Shenaya didn't know was that David Hendricks had been teaching at Riverside Academy for 23 years. He'd watched the school evolve, or try to, as it slowly diversified from the all-white institution it had been when he first started. He'd seen the subtle and not-so-subtle ways that some staff members resisted that change, the microaggressions that accumulated like poison in the system. And he'd kept meticulous notes because David Hendricks was, above all else, a scientist. He believed in evidence, in documentation, in the power of undeniable truth. That afternoon, instead of going to the teacher's lounge for lunch, Mr. Hendricks went to his car and sat in the parking lot, making phone calls. The first was to the school district's Equity and Inclusion Office, where he filed a formal complaint about what had happened to Shenaya. The second was to Marcus Williams, an old college friend who now worked as an investigative journalist for the Atlanta Constitution. "I think I have a story for you," David said when Marcus picked up. "But it's bigger than just one incident. I need you to trust me on this." That evening, when Diane Mitchell got home from her nursing shift, exhausted and worried after the school had called to tell her about Shenaya fainting, she found her daughter sitting at the kitchen table, quiet and withdrawn. "Baby, what happened?" Diane asked, sitting down beside her and taking her hands. Shenaya told her everything, the words tumbling out in a rush. About the heat, the broken fountain, Mrs. Pemberton's words, the emphasis on you scholarship students, the implication that she didn't belong, that she should know her place. Diane felt something break inside her chest. She'd worked so hard to give Shenaya opportunities, to put her in spaces where she could thrive and reach her full potential. But she'd also known, with the weary knowledge of a black woman who'd lived through her own share of discrimination, that those spaces would not always welcome her daughter with open arms. "Do you want to switch schools?" Diane asked gently. "We can figure something out." Shenaya shook her head fiercely. "No. I love my classes, Mom. I love learning there. I just wish people would see me for who I am, not just as a scholarship student who doesn't belong." Diane pulled her daughter into a tight embrace, and they sat there in their small kitchen, drawing strength from each other the way they always had. The next day when Shenaya returned to school, things seemed normal on the surface. She went to her classes, took her notes, tried to ignore the whispers she thought she heard in the hallways. But Mr. Hendricks pulled her aside after chemistry class. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Better, thank you. And thank you for the water and for calling the nurse. Shenaya, I want you to know that I've reported what happened to the district office. What Mrs. Pemberton did was unacceptable. No student should be denied access to water, especially when they're clearly in distress." Shenaya felt a flutter of anxiety in her stomach. "I don't want to make things worse for myself here." Mr. Hendricks knelt down so he was at eye level with her. "Listen to me carefully. You did nothing wrong. You asked for help when you needed it, and you were turned away because of biases that have no place in education. That's not on you. That's on the adults who failed you. And I promise you I'm going to make sure this gets addressed properly." What Mr. Hendricks didn't tell Shenaya was that he'd already begun a much deeper investigation. He'd reached out to former students, particularly students of color who'd graduated in recent years, and asked them about their experiences at Riverside Academy. The stories that came back to him were heartbreaking in their consistency. Black and brown students being disciplined more harshly for the same infractions as white students. Being discouraged from taking advanced classes. Being made to feel like visitors in spaces that should have been equally theirs. Can you believe they treated her like this? What would you do if you were in Shenaya's shoes? Let us know in the comments below. Meanwhile, Marcus Williams had started his own investigation. He'd obtained enrollment data from the school district showing that while Riverside Academy claimed to be diverse, the advanced placement and honors courses remained overwhelmingly white. He'd found records of complaints filed by parents of color that had been dismissed or inadequately addressed. He'd interviewed current and former staff members who spoke, some on the record and some anonymously, about a culture that paid lip service to inclusion while maintaining subtle barriers that kept students segregated by race and class. 2 weeks after Shenaya's fainting incident, the district's Equity and Inclusion Office sent an investigator to Riverside Academy. Her name was Dr. Patricia Johnson, a no-nonsense black woman with a doctorate in educational psychology and a reputation for thorough, unflinching investigations. Dr. Johnson spent 3 days at the school interviewing students, staff, and administrators. She reviewed discipline records, enrollment data in advanced courses, and records of parent complaints. She walked the hallways, noting which water fountains worked and which didn't, which bathrooms were renovated and which remained in disrepair, and whether those patterns correlated with which students used them most frequently. When she interviewed Mrs. Pemberton, the assistant principal was defensive from the start. "I simply enforced a posted rule," Mrs. Pemberton insisted. "The girl was drinking from a staff fountain. There are student fountains available throughout the building. Were you aware that the student fountains in the science wing have been non-functional for several weeks?" Dr. Johnson asked, her pen poised over her notepad. Well, I'm sure that's been addressed by now." "It hasn't. I checked them myself this morning. Still broken." "And yet you denied a clearly unwell student access to water during a heat wave because she used a fountain designated for staff." Mrs. Pemberton's face flushed. "There are protocols for a reason. We can't just have students wandering into administrative areas whenever they please." "Did it occur to you," Dr. Johnson said, her voice deadly calm, "that a student willing to risk disciplinary action to access a staff fountain might be in genuine need? Did you notice that this child was showing signs of dehydration? Did you care?" The silence that followed was damning. Dr. Johnson's investigation revealed a pattern that went far beyond Shenaya's experience. She found that Black and Latino students at Riverside Academy were disciplined at rates 3 times higher than white students for subjective infractions like disrespect or disruption. She found that guidance counselors routinely steered students of color away from advanced courses, citing concerns about their readiness or suggesting they might be more comfortable in standard-level classes. She found that the scholarship program, while technically open to all, was advertised almost exclusively in affluent, predominantly white neighborhoods, with minimal outreach to the communities the district claimed it wanted to serve. And she found something else, something that made her blood run cold. In the past 5 years, 7 students of color had left Riverside Academy, and in their exit interviews, every single one cited experiences of discrimination, isolation, or feeling unwelcome. The school had filed these reports away and done nothing. 3 weeks after her investigation began, Dr. Johnson submitted her report to the school board. It was 37 pages long and meticulously documented. The findings were clear and damning. Riverside Academy, despite its claims of diversity and inclusion, maintained a hostile environment for students of color through a combination of explicit policies and implicit biases. The school board called an emergency meeting. Parents packed the auditorium, and the air crackled with tension. On one side sat families like the Mitchells, who'd experienced discrimination firsthand. On the other sat legacy families who insisted that Riverside Academy was being unfairly attacked, that isolated incidents were being blown out of proportion. Mr. Hendricks was there, sitting in the back row with his documentation spread across his lap. Marcus Williams was there too, his recorder running, capturing every word for the story that would run in Sunday's paper. And then Shenaya stood up to speak. Diane had tried to talk her out of it, worried about the toll it would take on her daughter, but Shenaya had insisted. "Mom, if I don't speak up now, nothing will change. Mr. Hendricks taught me that science is about observation and evidence, about standing up for the truth even when it's uncomfortable. I have to do this." Now, standing at the microphone in front of hundreds of people, Shenaya felt her hands shake. But when she spoke, her voice was clear and steady. "My name is Shenaya Mitchell, and I'm a freshman at Riverside Academy. 3 weeks ago, I fainted in my chemistry class because I was denied access to water during a heat wave. But that's not really what this is about. This is about walking into classrooms where you're one of 3 faces that look like yours and feeling like you have to be twice as good to be seen as half as worthy. This is about being called a scholarship student like it's something to be ashamed of, instead of something to be proud of. This is about watching your mother work 2 jobs so you can have the education you deserve, and then being made to feel like you don't belong in the spaces that education opens up." Her voice wavered for a moment, but she pressed on. "I love learning. I love science and math and the way knowledge can unlock the world. But I shouldn't have to fight for basic dignity to access that learning. None of us should. And if my story, if what happened to me, can help make sure that no other student has to choose between their health and following rules that shouldn't exist in the first place, then it was worth it." The auditorium erupted. Some people applauded. Others shouted objections. The school board president had to bang his gavel repeatedly to restore order. But then something unexpected happened. Mr. Hendricks stood up, walked to the front of the auditorium and requested to speak. The board, recognizing him as a longtime faculty member with an impeccable reputation, granted him the floor. "I've taught at Riverside Academy for 23 years, he began. "I've seen a lot of students come through these doors. Some of the brightest minds I've ever encountered have sat in my classroom, and Shenaya Mitchell is absolutely one of them. But here's what I've also seen. I've watched as this institution has failed again and again to live up to its stated values of inclusion and equity." He pulled out a folder from his bag. "I have here documentation of 32 separate incidents over the past 5 years where students of color were disciplined more harshly than white students for identical infractions. I have testimonies from former students about being discouraged from taking advanced courses despite having the grades and test scores to qualify. I have data showing that while our student body is becoming more diverse, our honors and AP classes remain overwhelmingly white and wealthy." The auditorium had gone silent now, everyone hanging on his words. "When Shenaya collapsed in my classroom, it wasn't just because she was denied water. It was because she'd internalized the message that her needs, her well-being, her very presence in that space was less important than maintaining arbitrary hierarchies. And that message came from us, from the adults who are supposed to protect and nurture all students equally. We failed her. And we continue to fail students like her every single day." Mr. Hendricks turned to face Mrs. Pemberton, who sat with the other administrators, her face pale. "When you told Shenaya she couldn't drink from that fountain, when you reminded her that she was a scholarship student as if that diminished her worth, you didn't just enforce a rule. You communicated to a brilliant, hard-working child that she was less than. That her suffering was acceptable as long as she stayed in her assigned place. And that, colleagues, is not education. That's oppression dressed up in school uniforms and posted policies." The impact of his words rippled through the room like a shock wave. Several teachers who'd been sitting in stony silence looked uncomfortable now, shifting in their seats. Some parents dabbed at their eyes. "I'm not here to destroy this institution," Mr. Hendricks continued, his voice softening slightly. "I'm here to save it. Because a school that doesn't serve all its students equally isn't actually a school at all. It's just a gated community with textbooks. And we can be so much better than that. We must be better than that." When he finished speaking and returned to his seat, the silence lasted for several long seconds. And then, slowly, people began to applaud. Not everyone, but enough. Enough to matter. The school board deliberated for 2 hours behind closed doors. When they emerged, the president read a prepared statement. Mrs. Pemberton was being placed on administrative leave pending a full review of her conduct. All staff members would undergo mandatory training on implicit bias and cultural competency. The scholarship program would be completely overhauled, with active recruitment in underserved communities and additional support systems for scholarship students. A standing committee on equity and inclusion would be established, with student and parent representatives having voting power. And the water fountains? All of them would be accessible to everyone, with clear signage and a commitment to immediate maintenance when issues arose. But the real changes came in the weeks and months that followed. Marcus Williams's article ran on the front page of the Sunday edition, and it sparked a broader conversation about equity in schools across the state. Other districts began examining their own practices, their own patterns of disparity. At Riverside Academy, the culture shift was gradual but real. Some teachers and administrators who'd been resistant to change quietly left for positions elsewhere. Others, inspired by Mr. Hendricks's example, began examining their own biases and making genuine efforts to reach all students equally. The scholarship program expanded, and new support systems were put in place, including peer mentoring and academic counseling specifically designed to help scholarship students navigate the transition to a new school environment. Shenaya continued to excel in her classes. She joined the science club and eventually became its president. She formed a student organization focused on equity in education, and her voice became one that administrators learned to listen to rather than dismiss. She never forgot that moment in the hallway with Mrs. Pemberton, but she also never let it define her. Instead, she let it fuel her, a reminder that systems only change when people demand better. Mr. Hendricks continued teaching, but he also became an advocate within the school for equitable practices. He reviewed discipline data quarterly, flagged disparities to administration, and mentored younger teachers on creating inclusive classroom environments. He and Shenaya developed a friendship built on mutual respect, the kind of connection that occasionally forms between a teacher and student when they recognize in each other a shared commitment to justice. 2 years later, when Shenaya was applying to colleges, Mr. Hendricks wrote her a letter of recommendation. In it, he described not just her academic brilliance but her courage, her willingness to stand up and speak truth even when it cost her something, even when it would have been easier to stay silent. Shenaya Mitchell, he wrote, represents the best of what education can produce, a mind sharpened by rigorous study and a spirit strengthened by adversity. She will not just succeed in your institution, she will transform it as she has transformed ours. Shenaya got into her first-choice school on a full scholarship. At her high school graduation she gave the salutatorian speech, and in it she talked about that day in the hallway, about the moment that had threatened to break her but instead had forged her into someone stronger. I learned that day that silence in the face of injustice is complicity, she told her graduating class. But I also learned that one person speaking up can start a ripple that becomes a wave. Mr. Hendricks didn't have to report what happened to me. He didn't have to spend his own time investigating patterns of discrimination. He didn't have to risk his comfortable position to stand up for a student he'd only known for a few weeks. But he did because he understood something fundamental, that education without equity is just the replication of inequality across generations. She looked out at the audience, at her mother in the front row crying tears of pride, at Mr. Hendricks sitting with the other faculty members, at Dr. Johnson who'd come to see this moment, and at all the students who would come after her. So to everyone who will walk these halls after we're gone, don't accept cruelty as policy. Don't mistake rules for righteousness. Don't let anyone tell you that your worth is determined by your zip code or the color of your skin or the size of your bank account. And when you see injustice, even small injustice, even injustice dressed up as procedure, speak up. Because every voice matters. Every story matters. Every student deserves to be seen, valued, and given the chance to thrive. The applause that followed was deafening. Years later, when Shenaya had graduated from college with a degree in chemical engineering and was working on sustainable energy solutions, she sometimes thought about that Thursday in September. She thought about how close she'd come to internalizing the message that she didn't belong, that her needs were less important, that she should accept less than she deserved. And she thought about David Hendricks, a white man in a position of relative comfort who'd chosen discomfort because it was right, who'd used his privilege and platform to amplify a story that needed to be heard. She thought about how one person's decision to see injustice and refuse to look away had changed not just her life but the lives of countless students who came after her. The final piece of the story came 5 years after Shenaya's graduation. Riverside Academy commissioned a new building for their science program, funded by a combination of district money and private donations. At the dedication ceremony, They unveiled a plaque that would hang in the main hallway of the new facility. It read, "The Shenaya Mitchell Science Center. Dedicated to the principle that every student deserves access to knowledge, dignity, and the basic necessities of life. May we never forget that true education begins with seeing the humanity in every person who walks through our doors." Shenaya stood next to Mr. Hendricks at the unveiling, both of them older now but connected still by the moment that had changed everything. As the crowd applauded and cameras flashed, Shenaya felt something shift inside her chest, a feeling of wholeness and completion. Because this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every student who'd ever been made to feel less than, every child who'd been denied basic dignity, every young person who'd been told that the spaces of learning and opportunity weren't meant for them. It was about the power of standing up, speaking out, and refusing to accept injustice as inevitable. "Thank you," Shenaya whispered to Mr. Hendricks as they stood side by side. "For what?" he asked. "For seeing me. For caring when you didn't have to. For teaching me that science isn't just about formulas and experiments. It's about observing what's wrong and working to make it right." Mr. Hendricks smiled, and in his eyes, she saw the same fierce belief in justice that had driven him to make those first phone calls all those years ago. "You didn't need me to teach you that, Shenaya. You already had that courage inside you. I just helped give you the evidence to support what you already knew was true." As the ceremony concluded and people milled about the new science center, exploring the state-of-the-art facilities and gleaming equipment, Diane Mitchell pulled her daughter aside. "I'm so proud of you, baby," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not just for this but for everything. For not letting that moment break you. For using your voice. For becoming exactly who you were always meant to be." Shenaya hugged her mother tight, thinking about all the sacrifices Diane had made, all the double shifts and missed dinners and moments of exhaustion pushed aside so that Shenaya could have opportunities. "I learned from the best, Mom. You taught me that hard work and dignity go hand in hand, that our worth isn't determined by how others see us but by how we see ourselves." And that really was the heart of it. In the face of bias and injustice, courage and determination always win. Not because the path is easy or the victory guaranteed, but because speaking truth has a power that silence never will. Because one person's refusal to accept wrong can inspire dozens, then hundreds, then thousands to demand better. Shenaya Mitchell walked into Riverside Academy as a scholarship student who was made to feel like she didn't belong. She walked out as a graduate who transformed the very definition of belonging, who'd proven that excellence has no single face and opportunity should have no gatekeepers. And somewhere, in schools and institutions across the country, other students are learning what Shenaya learned, that your voice matters, that your story has power, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to accept that injustice is just the way things are. Because it isn't. It never was. And it never will be as long as there are people brave enough to say so. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the power each of us has to stand up for what's right, hit that subscribe button. These are the stories that need to be told, the moments of courage that remind us what's possible when we refuse to stay silent. And here's my question for you. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment where someone in power stood up for what was right, even when it was uncomfortable? Share your story in the comments. Let's build a community of people who believe that change is possible, one voice, one story, one act of courage at a time.